This is How About That Podcast, a show dedicated to all things Dallas Cowboys. With both objective and subjective perspectives, How About That Podcast is your place to hear about America's team. Now, here's Joseph Hoyt and Danny Morales.
Joey, I think I know the answer to this already, but do you pop?
Do I pop?
Do you pop?
What do you mean by that?
When you get up, do your joints, do your bones, do you hear pops?
No, more like crack. Like they'll like crack sometimes. Like I'll move my knee around and it'll crack or something like that. But no, I'm not at the popping phase of my life just yet.
Okay, maybe it's just being 30. But dude, I've been popping a lot. I'm not even like, because I've always cracked. I had like a really bad knee injury all through high school football, so like my knee has always been really cracky. My shoulder with my AC joint, weird, right? But I've just been like emphatically popping more. Like there's volume. It's like very audible. And ironically, my fiance is very similar too. She has it's not being double jointed. It's kind of the other thing. I can't think of it right now. But so she's more prone to popping. But between the two of us, it's like a damn Pop-Tart factory in here, how much popping there is. It's insane. I just want to know if that's a me thing, it's an age thing, or if it's just being 30.
I honestly, I can't speak for 30-year-olds, but I feel like it happens. Like it's not the craziest thing in the world. I would say popping. I'm probably going to end up popping at some point. I have a family history of bad backs. My dad had 2 back surgeries. I'm pretty sure my grandpa had 2 back surgeries. So I got to keep my back healthy or else it's going to be popping really fast.
Yeah. You got like a chiropractor on lock already?
No, chiropractors scare me.
Why?
Because what do? It makes your back feel good.
They pop you.
They do pop you. For like what? It feels good for a few days, and then it's like, oh, I need to go back to the chiropractor. But are they really doing anything for your long-term back health? I don't know. I haven't looked a ton into it, so I don't want to discredit all chiropractors. I don't want
anti-chiropractor pod. The How About That podcast? Anti-chiropractor.
Yes.
Anti-returning your shopping cart and anti-chiropractor.
Big anti-shopping cart return.
Yeah. Interesting. It's funny. When I was younger, the only thing I would pop is when I popped, locked, and dropped it. And now I'm just popping constantly, man. It's bad. So I'm old.
Pop off, Joe.
Pop off. Speaking of pop off, let's talk Dallas Cowboys training camp, because that's about to pop off and the entire NFL season is about to pop off. We're recording this Thursday, July 18th. We have an interview with Nick Harris from DallasCowboys.com. That was recorded, I believe, on Tuesday. Might have been Monday. It's been a long week as we gear up for training camp. But basically, we're doing a little training camp preview today. You're going to love the interview with Nick. He's fantastic. Joey, Nick and I go back all the way to 2016, which, if you know Nick, I think he's like 25. So, I mean, I got to know him when we were both covering high school sports. I was an intern at the Dallas Morning News in 2016. He was like a freshman in college, or even like a senior in high school, covering high school stuff and recruiting. He eventually ascended to covering national recruiting, and now he's a Dallas Cowboys beat reporter for DallasCowboys.com. One of the best dudes in the business. So if you don't already follow him and follow his stuff, go do it, because he's a really good dude. And, I'm happy that we had a chance to talk with him. It's funny, Joey, last year, me and him both kind of said like, hey, we're like the rookies on the beat because we were both new to it. So now me and him are both hoping to avoid sophomore slumps. We shall see how that starts on Tuesday in Oxnard. I'll be there. I'm excited. That's when players report. So, that's when they get to California. We'll probably have some content from there. And then starting from there, it's going to be content. A lot of stuff on Lone Star Live. Joey and I and Danny too, are going to be trying to talk a lot on the podcast as well. Basically, football season is here, Joey. One, how excited are you for that?
For football season, I feel like Oh my gosh. It hasn't fully hit in yet in July. I think it's going to start hitting in really soon that like football season is right around the corner. It hasn't hit yet, but I know when it does, I'll just be, it's an indescribable feeling, honestly.
Yeah, it just feels right. I'm excited for just the weekly. There's such a rhythm to the NFL season. It's why I love covering football more than any other sport, to be honest, is because one, there's fewer games because I think that adds so much more importance and it kind of adds so much storytelling potential. But I also just love the rhythm of it. It's there's a good cadence to it. It's all right. You got your Monday morning quarterback stuff. You got in the middle of the week prepping for next week, next week's game. Obviously, game rolls around and there's a lot of things that happen. But another reason I love the football season, Joey, is that we're out of the off season. And we're out of like the dog days of the off season, which we currently are. And I'm so excited to get out of it because there's just, when there's not a lot of things to talk about, people tend to reach and talk more. And one of the things that caught my eye this week was Colin Cowherd talking on his podcast about the top 10 ESPN rankings, which have been very interesting. Jeremy Fowler has done a great job collecting those. Basically, ESPN has conducted anonymous surveys with executives, coaches, and scouts from across the NFL. And basically what ESPN asked them is, hey, give me your top 10 at every position, right? And there's been some interesting stuff. We talked about Dak Prescott. He was placed 10th on ESPN's ranking, which is way below where I had him in mind. And I had him at 4th. And maybe I was just too close to the sun on that. I still believe there's a lot of merit to that idea of him being a top 5 QB. I think we talked about it last time, Joey. You could probably put quarterbacks 4 through 15 in any order, frankly. And that includes also one Jordan Love. And in these rankings, Jordan Love was not among the top 10 quarterbacks. But Colin Cowherd then used that as a segment to say, hey, Jordan Love should be a top 10 QB in this league. Specifically, he's better than Dak Prescott. A big part of his argument was the fact that if you go back to what happened in the playoffs last year, Jordan Love was very efficient. I believe he was 16 of 21 for, I think, 272 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. Obviously, the Packers had a good running game kind of flowing there, so he was able to bounce off that. And that was really indicative of, honestly, what he did in the entire second half of the season. He was fantastic. I know we'll talk more about that in a second, Joey. Dak Prescott in that game, meanwhile, was not fantastic. I think he was 41 of 60, over 400 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, including a back-breaking interception that really kind of put the Cowboys at a disadvantage. It was a pick 6 in the first half that almost spelled the outcome of it right then and there. So that was a big part of Cowherd's argument. You can read more about that on Lone Star Live. He also kind of did this argument of, hey, if I'm watching a TV show on Netflix, and I thought this was actually a pretty good basis for his argument. If I'm on Netflix and someone says, hey, go watch this show, and if I don't like the show after watching it for 5 episodes, I might tap out, which I respect. That's not my speed. For example, I started watching House of the Dragon finally. So I binged through season 1, and it was pretty slow at first, to be honest. Like there were some good seeds and some kind of crazy stuff, but it was pretty slow. After episode 4 or 5, though, that thing picked up in season 1, and season 2 has not stopped. I'm 2 episodes into season 2, Joey, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I'm excited to see where the rest of the season goes. Anyways, long story short, Cowherd believes that Jordan Love is better than Dak Prescott and should be a top 10 QB in the NFL. What was your kind of reaction to that, and kind of just the basis of, hey, Jordan Love versus Dak Prescott? Because these are 2 NFC guys that, honestly, by the time of the season's done, this coming season, one of them might have the claim to being the best NFC quarterback. Who knows?
It's definitely an open competition, but the first thing I thought was, who is delivering this message? And that's Colin Cowherd. Where did these rankings come from? People who are actually in and on NFL teams. So I feel like the Jeremy Fowler article definitely has a little more credibility than Colin Cowherd. No offense. He's a great he puts on a great show, should I say. And he brought up the fact that Jordan Love's last 10 starts have been amazing, right? And I looked at it, and Dak has more passing yards in that time, more passing touchdowns. Sure, he has 3 more interceptions. The QB rating is basically the same as is the completion percentage. Like, they played very similar to those final 10 games. And he was like, oh, it's not even close. And I don't know. I get it. Like you said, the Packers kind of dismantled the Cowboys, but that's not like Dak gets too much blame for that game because that defense for the Cowboys was clearly a problem.
Yeah, I always go back to – oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But I always go back to what Jordan Love literally told Micah Parsons on his podcast where he's like, hey, we knew you guys had no linebackers. So we figured we're just going to run it up against you guys, establish the run, and then go up play action off that, which, to be honest with you, has been a formula for success against the Cowboys for quite some time. I mean, you look at what other teams have done that have really kind of handled them. Look at what Buffalo did last season. It wasn't Josh Allen running all over them. It was James Cook, who I think ran for 500 yards in a quarter. It was crazy. But, obviously the Shanahan influences between the Rams, between obviously the Packers too. The 49ers have had their number. I think Cowboys run defense and what follows after that and the subsequent consequences has been a problem. And, I to your point, I don't know if using that game and that game alone should be the basis for the argument. Dak also has, is 2-5 in the postseason, which is something Colin Cowherd pointed out. But I agree with you. I wouldn't put the most latest version of Dak Prescott in the playoffs as entirely his fault, as the reason why you should put Jordan Love ahead of him.
I agree. I think it's close. It's very close, but Dak's just done it for longer. And Jordan Love, this could definitely be the year where he kind of goes over Dak. But to say it's not close and to say Jordan Love this, Jordan Love that, little premature.
I agree. And Jordan Love is so – it was so fun to watch him last year, Joey, because – and again, maybe a little biased here because he was my fantasy football quarterback that led me to a championship. But it was so fun to watch because we did not know anything really about him, right? I mean, we knew – I mean, if you looked at, like, what he did at it was Utah State, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you it was one of those things like, yeah, talent for sure, but we'll see what actually happens when he gets out there. And it took him a long time to get out there. And I'll be honest with you, I had way, way less expectations for him than I did for Aaron Rodgers when he replaced Brett Favre. And it kind of started off a little bit slow, and you're like, oh, maybe, who knows if he's actually the guy. But then you saw the talent really kind of change into just absolute baller mentality in that second half. I thought he was fantastic, and I think they had a good running game. Later on, when Aaron Jones started cooking, I think he had. Yeah, I think in the first half of the season they didn't have a 100-yard rusher or something like that, and then I think in like 3 of the last 4 games, Aaron Jones ran for 100+ yards. They did really, really well once that component started working. So we'll see what happens. I think by the end of the season, Jordan Love may be a better quarterback than Dak Prescott in the minds of everyone out there. But that survey said that right now Dak Prescott's ahead, and I agree.
Me too.
You're a smart man. Also, other things from the top 10 list, which has been really a cool series. It's cool to kind of get a pulse of what like the NFL is thinking about these players, and not just what I think, right? Or any other reporter or any other content creator covering these teams. The one that really stuck out to me was actually released today, Joey, and it was the corners, top 10 corners. And if you look at the rankings, there's a lot of like, hey, for example, the number 1 corner on the list, I believe, was who was the number 1 corner on the list? Pat Surtain, right? And his highest ranking, obviously, was number 1 in terms of some scouts, executives, and coaches. His lowest ranking was 10. So that was kind of the same thing with Denzel Ward, who was second. His highest ranking was 1. His lowest ranking was 10. So there's a lot of variation, I think, in terms of how people are looking at these elite groups of corners. It was shocking, though, in my opinion, that neither Deron Bland or Trayvon Diggs were on this list. Trayvon Diggs, I understand more coming off a torn ACL. You got to let things play themselves out a little bit. And he was listed as an honorable mention guy. Joey, DaRon Bland was not even listed as an honorable mention guy. He was in the also receiving votes category, which is like 3 waves away from the top 10, essentially. That's like saying like, oh yeah, I could have gone to Stanford if I had a 4.8 and I actually did well in school and other things. It's like, no, you're far off, bro, from that list. So that blew me away. What did you think about that? Were you shocked as I was about that?
I just want to go back to the point you said about Surtain being 1 highest, 10 lowest. I think the top 4 people on that list, which were him, Sauce Gardner, Denzel Ward, and
L'Jarius Sneed.
They were all 1 through 10. Sauce Gardner was unranked in at least one of like the people's rankings, which is crazy.
Which is insane.
Yeah. So the variation is definitely there. With DaRon Bland, though, I really do think that primetime game against the Seahawks just turned so many people away from just like being like, oh, I guess this is just like a Trayvon Diggs 2.0, like takes these big risks and makes good plays, but also gets burned in coverage. So I really don't know how fair or unfair that is. I'm just saying that's how I think people saw it, because that was when most people saw him play.
Which is, I get that. My thing with that, though, is, and this is something with DaRon Bland that I was trying to really try and capture last season from like an objective standpoint. Is DaRon Bland just a flash in the pan that's like taking advantage of like really bad plays, right? Or is he the guy making plays? Is he the one that is a weapon on defense, a scoring threat on defense? Is he, he's always getting these interceptions, or is he putting himself in those positions and then capitalizing on them? I think one thing that doesn't get talked about enough is I think corners specifically have to be taught how to make plays when the ball's in the air. Everyone's like, oh, hey, corners are just wide receivers that don't have hands. That shouldn't be the case, right? You can teach these things. And I think Al Harris does a fantastic job of getting these guys not only from a like fundamental, let's go make interceptions, but you have to have conviction to make interceptions. You have to be willing to make a mistake here and there in order to make plays. Because if you're net positive, you are winning. You are good. There's a reason why DaRon Bland had so many interceptions last year, and there's a reason why he's now the NFL record holder for most interceptions returned in a season. The dude makes plays, and I think for some reason that gets discounted when you're talking about cover corners. I don't know why. I think some people think that to the point you kind of made earlier, like, oh, he can't really cover. He's just risky as heck, and and it's boom or bust. And if you watch DaRon Bland, there's a lot of boom and not a lot of bust.
That's fair. That's very fair. I think this year will be very, very telling for that, and to show if 2023 was a one-off or not. Because I think that was kind of the same thing we went through with Trayvon Diggs, and he didn't even have in that next year. He didn't have like that same season, but he still had a really good year.
Or yeah, he was a Pro Bowler the year after. He had 11 interceptions. By the way, 11 interceptions, which is insane. The thing with DaRon Bland though, because he did it his rookie season too. I mean, the dude has 14 career interceptions already in 2 seasons, and if you look at what he did in 2022, it's not like he was the starting corner on the outside every single game. No, he was a rotational kind of in the slot guy. That kind of bounced around, was more of a depth piece. And sooner or later, he's like, you can't keep him off the field. So, I mean, crazy. I think over-under on DaRon Bland interceptions this season, especially with Trayvon Diggs back too, it's got to be like 5, right? That's got to be the over-under, 4.5, 5.5?
I'd say that's a very fair number.
Okay. Speaking of over-unders, there's a reason why I use that. It's what we call a segue in the business, Joey. The Cowboys, I believe it's to BetMGM. Yeah, BetMGM. They listed the Cowboys over-under win total at 9.5. So, which is, interesting. But that wasn't the big takeaway from what BetMGM posted, Joey. The big takeaway from BetMGM was that no other team has more bets on the under right now than the Dallas Cowboys, which means America thinks that Dallas is going to come go below 9 wins. A lot of America thinks that. And the one thing they didn't describe is like, well, is that the majority of bets or majority bets going over? Regardless, among all NFL teams, people are hitting the under on the Cowboys the most. What was your reaction to that?
I want to know how much Stephen A. Smith impacts that, of just like making this whole like shtick of like the hatred towards the Cowboys on top of what they already had because they're quote unquote America's team. I think everyone just wants to see the Cowboys fail. So their win total could have been 7.5, and I'm pretty sure they would have still been very high up on the list in terms of most bet unders.
I think so too. I think it's kind of comes with the territory, but I also think people are saying, hey, you objectively got worse this offseason on paper, so you got to take a step back. The reason why that's probably not the smartest bet, though, as we all know, the Cowboys have won 12 games each of the last 3 seasons, right? That's not very fluky, and eventually that run's got to end. But they still have a lot of core pieces from those 3 seasons. You still have the quarterback, which is the most important. Even then, if the quarterback goes down, one of those seasons included Cooper Rush playing a lot of games. And I'm really excited to see Cooper Rush versus Trey Lance in training camp, speaking of training camp things. But that's probably just not – history tells us that's not a smart bet. We'll see what happens. I would bet the over on 9.5. If it was 10.5, I'd understand it a little bit more, Joey. 9.5 feels kind of low to be like confidently hitting the under on. I don't know.
No, I think that's very fair to say.
Yeah. So speaking of training camp, we talked with Nick Harris from DallasCowboys.com. Let's go to that interview. I had a lot of fun talking with him, catching up with the legend himself. He's driving to Oxnard, which is wild. This is just a short little drive over to California. But yeah, let's take a listen to my conversation with Nick Harris. All right, let's welcome in my fellow rookie from last season, one Nick Harris from DallasCowboys.com. Nick, first off, how you doing, man?
Man, doing good. Fellow sophomores now, right? I think we could say that collectively.
Yeah, no sophomore slump coming for us too, huh?
At all. Sophomore surge.
There you go. How you doing?
I'm doing good, man. We're let's see, about a week from tomorrow, as we're recording, heading out to Oxnard or reporting to Oxnard at least. It's already that time again, man. It feels like the offseason went like that. It feels like it went a lot faster than last offseason. So here we are.
Yeah, I mean, and you're also, if I'm correct, you're driving out there, yeah?
I am driving out there, yeah. So how it's set up at camp for us, for the people that work there, with our department, we get assigned like 2 or 3 rental cars. And so for our department, that's between 20, 25 people. And I'm still under 25, so I can't drive any of the rental cars. And so last year, by the final week I was there, I was like, yes, this is amazing. It's beautiful out here, but I am getting like such bad cabin fever, if you will, from just being like stuck in that little bubble. So I was like, you know what? I'm taking my car this year. I'm taking my golf clubs. Me and Joe, we're going to get some golf rounds in, and I'm going to be able to drive anywhere I want when I want. So that was kind of the logic behind it. And also, I'm a sicko for the road, so I'm driving.
I think "sicko for the road" is just going to be your caption quote from now on. Anytime a photo comes up, it's just Nick Harris, "sicko for the road." Also, weird flex there saying, "Oh, hey, by the way, I can't have a rental car because I'm below 25." You're making me feel old.
Yeah, it's tough, and I didn't even realize that until we got out there last year. And I was like, no one could have communicated this. Like,
yeah. Well, first, before we dive into Cowboy stuff, I want to give a quick shout out to Nick, who I've known now for years. Which is, I mean, yes, he's below 25, but I've known him now since 2016
at least. Yeah.
Crazy, man. Me and Nick both kind of came up covering high school sports together. Then, he did an incredible job covering recruiting on a national level. And then he's now been with the Cowboys since the start of last season. I joined right at the start of the season last year. So I actually didn't get training camp. So this is going to be my first time. And I kind of figured, as we're talking training camp, why not have someone who's now a seasoned vet, aka after one season, one Nick Harris on to talk Cowboy stuff. Nick, very, very open-ended question for you. There's a lot to talk about in terms of Cowboys training camp, but what is the first thing that you kind of think of when you said, hey, I'm looking forward to watching this coming training camp?
So I'll loop preseason in with that, if that's okay here too.
Mm-hmm, perfect.
Okay. Trey Lance, Deuce Vaughn backfield. Like, if we're talking vibes, that's going to be a lot of fun, whether it succeeds or it doesn't. I mean, you look at Trey Lance, right? They used a 4th-round pick on him last year to bring him in, and we don't really know what for at this point. He hasn't touched the field in any sort of capacity in a competitive game. He had 0 snaps last year, but we see him working off to the side with quarterbacks coach Scott Tolzien, taking some time with Mike McCarthy at times, Brian Schottenheimer. And you hear all the rhetoric around those guys, and even with Dak Prescott, about how much he has developed over the course of the last year. Well, what does that look like? And so I think the preseason is going to be his big opportunity to show that he is an NFL quarterback, that he's an NFL caliber quarterback. And Stephen Jones already said it. He's going to be competing for that backup quarterback spot with Cooper Rush. So, and that's a task that's not going to be taken lightly, I feel like, because Cooper Rush, I mean, you look at it on paper, 4-1 as a starter whenever he's called upon, and he has done more than enough to solidify a backup job in the NFL. What can Trey Lance do to show that he's better than that? And I think that's going to be really important for him as we approach this preseason. And then you look on the flip side of that backfield equation, look at Deuce Vaughn, right? I mean, going into last year, it was kind of expected that he would find some sort of role in the offense, but he never did. And I think going into this year with a little bit different alignment up front on the offensive line, it could help him out. He'll be able to get used to that in the preseason with those rookies that'll be able to fit in up front and get used to playing on an NFL offensive line. I think that's going to benefit him. But also you look at the two returner equation that could be potentially factored in with the new kickoff rules. Special teams coordinator John Fossil has talked about the usage of two returners. And if that's the case, Deuce Vaughn would have to be the incumbent guy on that second spot next to Kavontae Turpin.
I want to talk more about Trey Lance here in a second because I think it's the most interesting storyline for the Cowboys in the preseason and perhaps, honestly, one of the more intriguing ones across the NFL. Yeah. But from a Deuce Vaughn perspective, last season, as you mentioned, not a lot of action, but it was kind of one of those things where it felt like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it felt like, hey, we'd like to get him in certain packages, but these packages are never arising. Mm-hmm. And after kind of the first half of the season, it's like, okay, now we're kind of using a roster spot on our active roster spot on a guy that we're not sure if we're actually going to get this package in the game. Maybe we'll deviate off of that, get Jalen Brooks involved a little bit. What would, in your opinion, Deuce Vaughn have to prove this preseason in order to ensure that, hey, maybe those packages actually do have a chance of getting on the field this season?
That he could be that dynamic playmaker that he was back in college. Now, does it have to be to that level that he was producing at Kansas State? Absolutely not. But if he could just show that he can come in and be that spark, be that lightning in a bottle that they expected to have whenever they drafted him, then I think he can find a way to carve a role in this offense. I mean, we saw it during OTAs and minicamp a little bit, of them lining him up at slot receiver. I mean, that's a perfect example of them trying to find how to use that playmaker that they have in their repertoire. And I think there's probably equal blame that goes with Deuce Vaughn and with the offensive coaching staff as to why he couldn't quite produce to the level that maybe some would have expected out of his rookie year. Just because whenever he did come into the game, go back and look at all of his carries. I mean, he was coming in when the second and third string offensive lines were in. He was having to shed guys off in the backfield before he could even get going. He didn't really have an opportunity to succeed, I feel like, at least in the regular season. And then, like you said, as the season went on and they started to find that 1-2 punch with Tony Pollard and Rico Dowdle, it just never really made sense to fit Deuce Vaughn back into the equation. But I think if they go into it with a lot more intention and purpose than they did last year, had those packages, like you said, that can kind of set him up for success, I think he can find a way to make it happen.
All right, let's talk a little bit of Trey Lance. Someone who is younger than Michael Penix, by the way, who was just selected in the first round this year. A guy that I think I did the math has about 1,000 less throws since Trevor Lawrence, since the start of their college careers. Long story short, a guy that missed a whole season, had to basically miss a whole season because of COVID. I mean, not for himself, but for the league. A guy that is a great unknown. It's someone we really don't know much about. One thing that I try to do with, kind of reading tea leaves, especially in offseason, is, hey, how much of the talk is legitimate, I guess, for a lack of a better word. And there's been a lot of positive talk about Trey Lance this offseason. Dak Prescott has sung his praises. We saw him working with Scott Tolzien constantly before games last year. I think you talked to Scott Tolzien about it last year, or you talked to Trey Lance in depth about that aspect of things. I guess from a preseason standpoint, what would you have to see to show you that, hey, this is legitimate, I guess, for the Trey Lance kind of conversation? What would he have to go out there and do in order in preseason to kind of validate, I guess, some of the things we've been hearing and to kind of validate the talent that we've kind of seen in flashes throughout North Dakota State, San Francisco, and then even a little bit in practice so far?
Yeah, I think he would have to prove what he did not prove with his time in San Francisco, right? Because whenever he went into San Francisco, and you might be able to speak even a little bit more being the Niners guy you are, but I think what he did at San Francisco, what he was expected to do was be able to use his athleticism a little bit more, be able to make those downfield passes a little bit more accurately on a consistent basis, be able to command an offense and be able to shed off pressure when those guys were in his face and be able to make something happen of it. I mean, he's got this athletic skill set that is so rare at the quarterback position. It's a big reason why he was drafted number 3 overall and why he was even a draft prospect to begin with. And now you factor that in with his inability, at least to this point, to be able to get out of pressured situations and get out of the pocket and throw on the run. I think that's a big reason why it didn't work out in San Francisco. And I think if they can figure out a way for that to work for him in Dallas and him be able to show that he's a lot more comfortable having that pressure in his face, being able to call things at the line, be able to get multiple playmakers involved and still be able to use his legs at the same time, then I think he finds a role as a backup quarterback on this team. But those are a lot of steps. And I know the last year has been used towards getting to those steps and finding a way to rectify those steps that they weren't rectified out in San Francisco. And we'll see how much of it was actually rectified whenever we get out to Oxnard. But it's going to be a fun storyline. Like, as you said, it could easily be one of the more fun storylines we see across the league just because there's so much unknown with him at this point. And, everybody's singing his praises, but what will that look like whenever he gets on the field?
I think it's also fascinating, too, that we haven't seen Trey Lance for a long time, and obviously that's not like a crazy concept with the guys that are backup quarterbacks. But this is a guy when you're the third overall pick, you had a season-ending injury the year before you got traded to the Cowboys. You didn't play at all last season. Part of me wonders, what would a year off essentially do for a quarterback of his talent capabilities? And I think that's going to be kind of fascinating to actually see early on in preseason what that looks like. One thing I want to ask you, and this is something I've talked about with him. I've been kind of impressed a little bit, though, with at least externally his demeanor approaching all this. This is a guy that, says, I like to control what I can control. But there's been a lot of uncontrollables for this guy. What have you seen from his demeanor, in terms of accepting being a backup and essentially taking a year off just to learn the position in the Cowboys offense?
Yeah, I think you could see it as soon as he arrived in the building, right? I mean, he came in, obviously you would have to imagine as a former number 3 overall pick being, thrown into that San Francisco system, expected to be the guy that would lead them to Super Bowls and lead them and all those offensive playmakers. He had to sit on the bench and watch that happen without him last year. And I think whenever he came in, he realized that he had a lot of steps that he needed to accomplish before he could get to a starting quarterback role. And I think that was the crucial first step for him, accepting what his reality was and being that, okay, hey, I'm being given another chance, but I'm going to have to work my way up a lot harder than I would have in San Francisco. And I think taking that step-by-step process has been really big for him. And, you talk to him throughout the year last year, I'd check in with him maybe once every 5 or 6 weeks, and you can see that comfort. You can see that confidence starting to rise a little bit. And I think that's big towards, speaking to what he could be whenever they hit the field in Oxnard. But yeah, I think from a demeanor standpoint, he's got it all right upstairs, but can that translate on the field? That's going to be the big part.
All right, Nick, this is what we call in the business a segue. Okay, so Trey Lance is on an expiring contract. Dak Prescott's expiring contract. Cooper Rush expiring contract. The entire coaching staff on 1-year deals. Heading into this training camp, you were at last year's training camp where obviously there was confidence, it seemed like, kind of going the regular season, but also like, hey, we got to put it together. Obviously, we know what happened in the regular season. Are you as curious as I am about the vibe of training camp? Like, if some of these other external factors, I mean, obviously, one, CeeDee Lamb not being, signed yet. Maybe by the time this comes out, who knows? But that's another. I mean, are you curious about the vibes of this training camp?
Yeah, I am. I think just the vibes of this season, really, because yes, let's start with training camp. Going out there right after, is there still a hangover from that crucial loss to Green Bay? You would have to assume there's at least some of that left behind. And depending on who you talk to from, you could take a poll of all 32 NFL head coaches and being like, hey, is it a good thing to remember this or is it a bad thing to remember this? I don't know. I think you get probably a half and half type group, but there's going to be people in the building that remember that. There's going to be people in the building that are trying to forget it and trying to move on to 2024 and, stake a clean slate. Whereas, I think if you get further into the season, let's say week 5, man, that schedule starts off really rough. You got at Cleveland, home against New Orleans, home against Baltimore. I mean, before the bye week, you are going to get some big-time hitters, and then coming right out of the bye week, you got to go to San Francisco. So if they're coming out of that San Francisco game, they're looking at like a 3-4 record. I mean, that's going to be really tough. And I think you talk about vibes. That's where the expiring contracts of the coaching staff and 30 players on the 90-man roster right now going into the final year of their contract. That's where it really starts to churning. It's like, okay, are we even going to be here next year? I think the vibes at that point would be the crucial, a turning point as to where that season could go. But you're right. It does start with training camp. It starts with Oxnard, because if you can't get out on the right foot, you'll never catch up.
A couple more questions for you about training camp. We have Tyler Guyton. We got Cooper Beebe competing with Brock Hoffman, maybe TJ Bass in that fold too. What are you looking forward to seeing out of that group, out of that offensive line? Are you as curious as I am also about just the chemistry standpoint of, hey, now we're going to throw in two new guys into a fold that kind of last season there was some fluctuation. That's something they talked about a lot. Zach Martin's going to be here for training camp this time, something he's actually excited for. What are your kind of predictions, thoughts, and just ideas going into the offensive line group heading into this training camp?
Yeah, I have two immediate thoughts when it comes to these rookies. We'll start with Tyler Guyton. Does he have to be the starter week one? That's the question that I have. And I'm not asking that to the masses. I'm asking that specifically to the coaching staff. Does he have to be the starter week one? And if he's not, then who is? Do you look at Chuma Edoga? Do you look at Matt Waletzko? Where Josh Ball? I mean, I don't feel like any of those three options you would be that comfortable with, unless Tyler Guyton just has a lot more learning to do than we expected. But granted, he's only got 14 starts of experience under his belt. I mean, he's going to have to take a crash course at left tackle and be able to get up to speed and be ready to block Myles Garrett in week one of the NFL season. And then the second thing is, how much of a shot does Brock Hoffman and maybe TJ Bass, how much of a shot do they actually have? Are they wanting Cooper Beebe to be the starting center? Are they going to force it and make it happen? Because you see that around the league sometimes. It's like, hey, you draft this guy with the assumption that he's going to plug and play, and he might not be ready, but just throw him in there and he'll be able to learn on the job, basically. And sometimes that works, and sometimes that doesn't. And so, how much of an opportunity does Brock Hoffman and TJ Bass have? I think it should be an equal opportunity with those two guys, just because you look at what they did whenever they got their opportunities to shine last year. And I think it would be just as reliable if Cooper Beebe ended up having an awesome camp and they decide to start Cooper Beebe over those guys. I feel like that would only elevate the competition of the room if they gave everyone a fair shot there.
Mm-hmm. A couple other things I'm looking forward to is I actually am so stoked about this kickoff rule, Nick. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to see what kind of things. It's going to be weird, but, I played a little rugby too, and I just see rugby happening, and I'm very curious to see what John Fossil cooks up. Obviously CeeDee Lamb's absence, something I'm looking forward to just seeing what would that look like. When does he come back? How does that affect things? Personally, I don't think it's that big a deal in terms of getting ready for the start of the season with receiver. Long story short, Nick, my final question here, what all else are you looking forward to most for this training camp? What has caught your eye? What storylines are kind of just, right in the front of your mind?
I think the defensive tackle position, that's one that I'm very curious to see shake out. What happens there? I think you could look at everybody who's competing for that starting one tech position, and you could say they all have an equal shot. I mean, look at Mozzie Smith. He's coming off of shoulder surgery, off-season shoulder surgery, has that weight gain finally picked back up, and is he, even at the play weight to be a one tech? And then they use a 7th-round pick on Justin Rogers out of Auburn. They pick up Denzel Daxon in the undrafted free agent pool out of Illinois, who I believe is just as talented as Rogers, just fell to that undrafted pool. And then you have Carl Davis, who's been around the league for 10 years, but hasn't really quite found an opportunity to slide in and start somewhere in the last 5, 6, 7 seasons. So how does that play out? That's going to be really interesting to follow for me, at least. And then Trayvon Diggs, when does he get back on the field? I saw him on Instagram yesterday working, and it looks like that change of direction is looking good. And it looks like he's all right, at least from my naked eye, scrolling through my phone on Instagram. But whenever he gets on the field in Oxnard, how much catching up does he have to do, both with the Mike Zimmer defense and getting his ACL back to play-ready style? So I think whenever those two things happen, that's going to be the things I look forward to. The defensive side of the ball, I think, just in general, is going to be really fascinating. With Mike Zimmer in the equation now, Eric Kendricks kind of helping lead that group, even though he's the new face in the group. It's going to be very interesting. I'm fascinated to see it.
Yeah, circling back to that Trayvon Diggs point, it's one of those things where, yeah, he looks good, everything looks right, but I feel like I made this mistake a lot last year from just a expectation standpoint of saying, hey, Tony Pollard should step in week one and be, completely ready to go, right? And there was some lingering stuff. Terrence Steele, it took a while to him to get back on his footing. So we'll see what Trayvon Diggs does. Nick, I'm excited for training camp. I know you are. I'm excited to see you out there, man. Thank you so much for taking the time, as always. And everyone, go check out Nick Harris online. He's got a great Twitter following. He's DallasCowboys.com is doing a fantastic job. Very proud of him. Keep up the great work, my guy. And thank you so much.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you.
All right, we're back from our conversation with Nick. And I think there's a reason why Nick has also ascended very quickly for a young guy. The dude knows how to talk ball, and I really, really enjoy talking with him. Joey, one thing that I want to talk a little bit further with you about is this concept of vibes in training camp, right? And maybe I'm just a vibes guy. I just, a temperature checker. I don't know. But I feel like naturally, Joey, there's got to be a little bit of weird vibes this offseason because, as we pointed out with Nick, a lot of expiring contracts, which means a lot of people are fighting for their jobs. And when people fight for their jobs, sometimes you get a little desperate, right? You're trying to impress, you're trying to do something. I think Dak Prescott won't get desperate, right? But even I think Danny and I talked about this too. Like, hey, what if Mike McCarthy's game calling gets affected by the desperation to impress or to win? What if he goes for a 4th and 4 that he might have not gone for last year in the regular season, but does in this case, it backfires, who knows, right? So what do you think about the concept of vibes, even early on in training camp, potentially being a thing?
I feel like the tale as old as time is that every team, and not every team, but probably 25 teams at least in the NFL think they can win the Super Bowl at the start of training camp. And then that slowly just goes down, 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 all the way throughout training camp into the first 2 weeks of the season. It's like, oh, we're 0-2. We stink again. We're probably not going to win the Super Bowl. I feel like that's a tale as old as time. But of course, there's a little bit of a difference here with the Cowboys because they are a really good team. Like you said, they've won 12 games the past, 3 years, 2 years, whatever it is. They just have this massive, massive cloud hanging over their head of none of us could be here next year if things pan out in a specific way. So say they go 0-2. Who do you know who their first 2 games are against?
Cleveland in week 1, and then for some reason week 2 always slips my mind on this.
New Orleans.
Oh, it's home against New Orleans. Yeah. So I mean, they need to go 1-1 at least. There.
Yeah. If they were to go 0-2, then that would just be the questions would pour in. If they lost to the Saints, I mean, the Saints are the Saints. They're gonna be a middling NFL team this year. That's what they are. And I just think if the Cowboys lose both those games, then it's just why wouldn't Dak just be all right? I mean, I shouldn't say that because he's an athlete. He's going to try to fight through and everything like that. But it could just be a matter of time if things don't pan out the right way. But at the same time, if things do pan out the right way and the vibes, say they go 5-0 to start the season, and then they're just kind of being a middle finger to Jerry in a sense of being why shouldn't you have signed us? And then just taking that on a run, which is exactly what Jerry wants in a sense. But I feel like that is just as possible as the negative outcome.
I think so too. I think I'm just so fascinated about this season because, it's almost like one of those movies where they start with the ending first and they're kind of working their way back, right? I think everyone assumes the ending on this. Yeah, they'll make the playoffs and then they'll face either the Packers or maybe the upstart Bears make the playoffs or, who knows, right? And they lose because that's what the Cowboys have done since 1995. They don't make it to conference title games. They haven't since then. So fans, and Danny's talked about this, the reason to believe that this is going to be any different. I think that is just such a theme that hangs over the entire season. And now you add in the fact that everyone's jobs could be on the line. Could be a recipe for some weird vibes. All right, we got to get out of here shortly, but really quick, Trey Lance versus Cooper Rush, Joey. That is something that Nick kind of hinted at. That's something that I'm watching. To be honest with you, I think it would have to take a lot for Trey Lance to beat Cooper Rush as the number 2, because Cooper Rush, all he's done is proven that he can be counted on, that he's reliable, he's good when he gets in there. But he, who knows? Maybe the idea of we want to see a little bit more talent or a little bit more of Trey Lance's potential on display, and we want to find out what we have. Maybe that becomes a thing. I don't know. That's the battle that I'm looking forward to a lot.
Yeah, it's floor versus ceiling in the end. I mean, you know what you're getting with Cooper Rush. It's a very serviceable backup quarterback, probably one of the better backup quarterbacks in the NFL. Trey Lance, a little, scary in San Fran. That's why the former 3rd overall pick was traded for a 4th rounder. But all signs are pointing that he's working really hard to improve everything. ESPN's Todd Archer just came out with the story talking about how he's working with the throwing coach. I forget his name.
Yeah.
Really, switched up his footwork, and he's just really, really grinding to make sure he gets everything right this offseason, because he knows how big this preseason is. Now, something with that I want to point out, could he have a little maybe too much pressure and just kind of dwindle in play because of that? He was really just not that good of a quarterback these past few years, obviously, and now he needs to do this or else his NFL career, I wouldn't say is over, but very close to that. And he's going to get all the opportunity. Archer pointed out that Dak doesn't play in preseason games. So this is like you pointed out too, this is Lance's preseason. He is the most interesting player. And I told you I wanted to point this out. What if there's a non-zero chance that Trey Lance does really well in the preseason, really, really well, Dak, and he beats out Cooper Rush for the backup job. Dak has to miss a game or two or whatever. Lance comes in, does super well, and the Cowboys risk it because of the financial stuff and say, you know what, Dak, you find yourself another team. We're going to try this out with Trey Lance. It would be crazy. But I don't think that is an impossible thing to think about.
I think desperation lends itself to craziness. I think anything can happen when your back's against the wall. The question is, in my opinion, Joey, do the Cowboys get to a point where their back is against the wall? And does that happen in the regular season? Because we know, obviously, when in the playoffs, that's what happens. But if that happens in the regular season, things could get weird. To your point, I don't think it's likely that happens, but who knows? The beauty of the NFL is you never know what's going to happen next. But here on Lone Star Live and on How About That podcast, we're going to be chronicling everything that happens with the Dallas Cowboys this season. So as my last plea to you is, as I go to training camp, and mind you, this is an investment from us to, send me. I'll be there from the 23rd to the 12th, which is that's a lot of time out in California. I'm not opposed to that. But that's an investment. I encourage you, if you like our stuff, you like our pod, you like my content, we're going to have a lot of it. Please tell your friends, share. It starts with you guys. We do it for you. So without you, we can't do these things. So that's my last kind of plea. Thank you, everyone, again, for listening to another episode of How About That podcast.
Thanks for listening to How About That podcast.